Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Sustainability in Motion podcast, brought to you by ED4S. We focus on the fast-moving sustainability world to help the business community better understand the sustainability and environmental challenges we face. I'm Matt Orsag, Chief Content Officer at ED4S.
Hello, and I'm Maria Maisaradze, founder and CEO at ED4S.
We have a bit of a special episode today as we'll be talking about a paper that we just published at ED4S. It's called Income Inequality, Its Causes, Impact on Society, and What Investors Can Do. This is a topic we're seeing increasingly come to the forefront in many countries in the minds of investors. So we thought it was one we should tackle. So what we're going to do is, Maria and I are both familiar with the paper, but we're going to have Maria ask me the questions, and then I'll answer them, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion. Of course, we invite you to read the paper and get back to us with any comments, questions, or thoughts you have through social media, or just reach out to us. All right, Maria, you ready?
Yeah, let's do this. So income inequality, a topic that is, I feel, not brought up enough in the finance community, however, is increasingly important. And I think the links are starting to be there through economics conversations. So let's start from the top. Why is income inequality topic for the investors to consider, and why did we choose it for our paper, Matt?
Yeah. As we hinted to before, it's a topic that's coming up more and more, and we'll talk about how this is measured and everything. The societies and civilizations go through periods of great inequality and less inequality. You know, they're kind of, you can see the waves of how this goes. In the United States, there was the Gilded Age about 100 years ago, where wealth was concentrated a great deal, and we seem to have gotten back to that kind of a second Gilded Age, if you will, in the United States, and you see this other places as well. There's a great quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis from 1941 that we actually started our paper with. We can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And what he's getting at is, and this is actually something that the Greeks wrote about, back thousands of years ago. Societies tend to go in these phases because those in power, those with wealth and political power, tend to try to concentrate the state in to serve their needs, which is a natural thing for humans to do, and it's up to the government or the state to resist that, so you have more equality. And over time, sometimes you get it to a place where wealth is more concentrated, and that means those with the wealth, those with the power, then the laws and bend the government to their will, so you have less equality. We seem to be in that place in a number of countries. One of the things we cite in the paper was a 2020 study by the RAND Corporation. They put kind of the first price tag on how much income inequality has cost America. And the bill they estimated is about $50 trillion, according to the study. $50 trillion has been diverted from the 99%, if you will, of working Americans to the wealthiest 1% since 1975. And this isn't a problem just in America, of course. Inequality statistics in Canada show similar things. The gap in the share of disposable income between the richest 2/5 of Canadians and the bottom 2/5 grew by 47% in 2024, according to Statistics Canada. And you can look up that report yourself. And in the EU, we're seeing similar things, similar studies to show us that the inequality gap is widening. So in the developed world, in the Western world, you see this in many places. So we thought this was an interesting thing that we should write about, talk about, because it's coming up in investors' discussions as well. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the types of inequality, not just wealth and income inequality. And they're all related, and you'll see how. We talked a little bit about wealth inequality, but there's also social inequality. Inequality in systems that make societies unequal. They're often rooted in wealth, but it gets into things like education or healthcare. Those at the top, those in the 1% or 10%, have better options for education, healthcare, and other services. And that just exacerbates the problem over time.
So I guess the why question is very similar to why is it we talk about climate change? Why is it we talk about biodiversity loss? The reason is because it's so deeply connected entire economies, right? Like the numbers you gave me are just staggering. Like there are huge amounts that are potentially being diverted from being reinvested into real economy towards investing potentially in the markets, and that inflates the capital markets values, right? So deeply interconnected with the capital markets, with investments, but also with policy, systemic change that is kind of really reshaping our today's realities, right?
And a good thing to understand about inequality is that it's unstable and unsustainable in the long run. Because, and there's two main reasons for that, is if you think about it, those with less disposable income usually spend more of that income on the essentials of life: shelter, food, water, gas for, to go to work, those kind of things. And if wealth is concentrated in the 1% or 10% that don't really spend that much money, then you have a kind of a headwind on GDP if you're in an economy that you want to grow. Most investors and most politicians want their assets to grow. And so if you're invested in the markets, there's a headwind on what your investments can achieve if you have gross inequality in that nation. Another one is simply instability. People see these things happening. And, if you have the most extreme example would be if you have one individual in a nation that has all the wealth and everybody else has none, well, that's not going to last very long because those people are going to band together and, do something about it. Likely violence, right? That's going to happen. So, the opposite of that is if, a perfectly socialist economy where no one owns anything and wealth is always rebalanced on a constant basis, that's the other end of the scale where there's no incentive to get ahead, for good ideas, new ideas, because everyone's going to have the same anyway. Well, there's a happy medium between those two extremes. But if the mass of people see that all the wealth is concentrated in the hands of just a few, and they see that no matter what they do, they can't get ahead and they don't have a voice, that's where you get things like the French Revolution or the American Revolution or any revolution. And so that's unstable politically as well as economically.
Yeah. So we chose the topic before the US elections, right? And we started working on it. And obviously the inequality was already very much visible. I mean, I've been in Toronto a few months ago and you could see homelessness, same thing in Montreal. It is really in front of our eyes today. And then we have Trump administration and we're seeing renewable energy projects shut down, farmlands shut down because of all the pullouts in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, but also government agencies being shut down and people being unemployed, basically. So I think what's happening right now is just exacerbating the problem, which potentially is moving us towards that tipping point, right? Like you're mentioning. So let's talk about the causes of inequality. How does the income inequality come about? How do we get there? What are different sources of it? Tell me about that.
Yeah, we already talked a little bit about, the concentration of wealth. If that's allowed to, I guess, fester is a good way to put it in an economy.
So is that tax related, the concentration of wealth?
It's usually, it often gets down to tax policy. And there was a good study back in 2021, Causes and Consequences of Income Inequality, an overview. And it shows that as personal income tax progressively declined in the West, so progressive means there's more tax on those with more income and more wealth. It declined from 62% in 1981 to 35% in 2015. Inequality has risen. And that makes sense, right? There's less money for roads and schools and hospitals and social programs because the tax rate went from 62 at the very top to 35 at the very top over the course of about 40 years. And so that just makes mathematical sense that there's less money to go around for everyone who's not in the higher tax brackets. But it also comes from a historical context. We talked a little bit about that and how concentration of wealth happens and government and policy needs to push back on that, or you get to kind of an oligarchy situation. But think about the ways that wealth is accumulated And the two main ways wealth is accumulated is usually in someone's house and their investments, right? And think about the historical context of slavery in the United States and the Jim Crow era in the United States. So slavery ends in the Civil War, but then there's policies throughout the South that disenfranchise African-American voters. So they don't have voting rights, they don't have property rights. There's a lot of stories of red line districts in companies or in cities, red line districts in cities where they wouldn't sell or rent or mostly sell houses to African Americans. And so think about that. Since the end of the Civil War, up and through the 1960s, where legislation was passed to amend those things, African Americans in the United States couldn't build wealth in their houses. They had access to lower level housing, and they couldn't build wealth that way. They couldn't get a mortgage. And it's very similar in banking industry. I read a book a couple of years ago called The Color of Money. And it's not a Tom Cruise movie from the 80s. It is that, but this is a different thing. It's called The Color of Money. And it was about how African Americans in the Jim Crow era had to start their own banks. They didn't have access. They weren't allowed to bank in places. And so you put those two things together and fast forward to today. And as of 2024, the median wealth of African American households in the U.S. is about $25,000. That's about 1/10 of the median wealth of white households in America, about $250,000. And the main driver of that is institutional historical context for those 100 years or so since the end of the Civil War. They weren't able to build wealth for all that period, and so that's part of that huge gap. It also gets into economic policies and tax policies that we talked about, but there's also social pressures as well. And you can look to India with the caste system. They've had in India for thousands of years. They have a lot of policies now that are trying to get rid of the caste system. But for literally thousands of years, families were considered the bottom of the bottom rung of society and couldn't build wealth, couldn't hold property, and so on. So these things can be institutionalized in a lot of different ways around the world, and that adds up over time, of course.
Yeah, and this is really the root of it. Like we're talking about the systematic or systemic wealth inequality, right? That persists today, and it's only getting worse as the world goes into more unstable reality. Okay, so this is very clear. Now, in terms of measurement of the inequality, because I understand that the income inequality might not always be a bad thing. I think it depends on what is the level of that difference in equality. And are you a developing country? Are you a developed country? Tell us a little bit about the measurement of this and what are some of the metrics that we can apply to assess how this income inequality potentially play out on the economic growth, on the country's, just a long-term success and systemic risks. What do we use in the industry?
Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. There's one kind of very scientific way, something called the Gini coefficient that's been developed. But I'll talk first about some of the other things we've already talked about. You can look at statistics on income or wealth or health, accessibility to healthcare, accessibility to education, opportunity within a society. Go back to the caste system in India. What castes were available to have the opportunity to grow wealth, to get ahead, to have these jobs, versus some castes were assigned to these other jobs. So there's those kind of metrics on looking at one metric of health or income or education. But an interesting metric to use is something called the Gini coefficient. It's named after a sociologist, Corrado Gini. I don't know if I'm pronouncing. I've always heard Gini, but it's Gini, but I've always heard it pronounced Gini.
Yeah, thanks for spelling it out. I was going to do that.
Yeah, for those of you Googling it, it's Gini. And I came across this years ago, but for this report, I remembered, this is something we wanted to look up. It's between 0 and 1 is how the math works. And there's a lot of Greek symbols and stuff that you can look up and how it's actually calculated. But a coefficient of 0 means a society is in perfect inequality. Everyone has the same. And of course, that's not the case. That's the example I gave of everyone, all wealth is readjusted in real time all the time. Perfect economic inequality, which would be insane because you'd always have to be rebalancing everything. And a coefficient of 1 represents maximum inequality society in which one person has all the wealth. And we look to see, and you can look up the Gini coefficients yourself, and you'll get a table of what 195, 96 countries we have in the world now, and what the Gini coefficient is in each. But we took out a sample of to give people an idea of what this is and what the numbers are. So remember, 0 is perfect equality, and 1 is highly unequal. And I'll just give you some of the numbers we found. South Africa is the most unequal at 0.63. That's quite high. Brazil is next at 0.53. The United States is at 0.40. Canada is at 0.32. And then Slovenia is one of the ones. The Western European countries tend to do better. Like Slovenia is 0.24, Belgium is 0.26, Ireland is 0.30. And I think I remember looking at the U.S., the historical numbers for the U.S. Let me see if we put this in our paper. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's been a while, but the U.S. is trending in the wrong direction. I think like 20, 30 years ago, it was like 0.33 or 0.34, and now it's 0.40. And you can look historically, what I think they started measuring this in like the 60s or 70s. You can see historically, the trend of countries, and a lot of them are getting more unequal. And so that's a way to measure by the Gini coefficient to compare Canada and the UK or the US and Belgium or whatever. And it ranks a lot of different metrics to get to what are, what's inequality in a country. Another one we looked at was the commitment to reducing inequality index, and it ranks governments on their policies and 3 different pillars: public services, taxation, and labor. What rights do people have? And what you find is in countries scoring the highest are Norway, Denmark, Germany, Belgium, Finland. So, Western European countries tend to be the most equal out there. And Canada is in the top 10 as well. They're at number 6. Those are 2 different. Gini is by far the more famous, the one you've probably heard of more. But the commitment of reducing inequality index is another one to look at. But they're meant to give you an idea of, again, what's the level of inequality in a society? How is it trending? What does it compare to other places? And that can be kind of a canary in the coal mine for you as an investor or someone interested in these things. The U.S. number is troubling because it's going in the wrong direction.
Okay, so I have a comment, and then I do want to do a follow-up question on that. So talking about indicators, an indicator that's very popular in current still economics is GDP per capita. And, as, U.S. GDP is increasing very sharply. We're still just looking GDP per capita, which is just a very simple formula and does not take into account that income inequality, right? The concentration of wealth on the top and the huge gap between the lower income and higher income. So I think the economics theories and assessments should really start looking at these things as an additional flag to identify potential problems in economic structure and start taking that into account in the policy, because it's so important. Clearly, it's been demonstrated over a century that it does have a tremendous impact on the risk and stability of the country, yet it's not yet used or at least integrated in, education, economics classes. Not something it's touched upon. GDP per capita is the ultimate, indicator that all the politicians are being scored on. And we're completely ignorant to this other part of the equation, which is where is that GDP concentrated in? That's
a great observation. And that GDP is a very interesting story. And I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here. It was, I'm trying to remember, I want to say 1934, right before the war, or right before America, a couple of years before America entered the war. And World War II hadn't started then, but it was soon to start. And an American economist was tasked with a way to better measure the use of our resources. right? GDP didn't exist. It had to exist. It had to be created, right? So it was created around the mid 1930s, I think 1934, by an economist, Simon Kuznets. And it is what we're used to today, aggregating the product, what's produced in a country. But interestingly enough, he warned that this shouldn't be used as a report card, as to see how healthy, the economy was, because all it did was aggregate what was produced in the economy. So, the classic example I give is, cigarettes. You can sell a lot of cigarettes, that increases GDP. And then you can sell a lot of healthcare of having to deal with the causes of cigarettes, and that raises GDP. So selling the cigarettes and then dealing with the bad effects of cigarettes boost your GDP, but that isn't good for your economy.
Absolutely. And that's the idea of like just a population that's very sick and requires lots of pills and lots of treatment is actually good for the economy. And that's what we should be optimizing for, which is completely counterintuitive and very, very wrong. But those of you who are listening and are into economics, I highly recommend discovering the book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. It's a really, really inspiring book. And I think a lot of what me and Matt discuss comes from that philosophy that economics is currently not built for the 21st century, and we need to rethink the whole approach to economics. So my question was, based on your work with either research with CFA Institute in the previous role, or just talking to investment community and banks, how much is the income inequality currently looked at by portfolio managers or economists among these institutions? Have you heard anyone talking about it or integrating this in a systemic way into their analysis?
It is a bit, but let me go back to what we were talking about before. Because when we're talking about indicators in GDP, I thought of people may want to look up, people understand the problems with GDP. And so other alternatives to GDP have been created. And, some are the genuine progress indicator, or GPI. It adjusts GDP for environmental, social, and financial factors. So, the smoking example would be adjusted downward. Human Development Index is another. You can find these and see how they measure things differently. And some cities and some countries are starting to use those in addition or instead of GDP. I've been reading the Economist magazine since I was, I'm not going to say how old I am, but like for 30 years now. And at the back of the Economist is GDP. That's the scorecard for all the countries. And if you read the Economist, it's a good magazine. I recommend it. But the idea behind it is growth, and GDP is what we're all about. That's what we need. That's what we want. We all want more of. And that's, the answer is no. We don't. We want more of a well-being economy where we're healthy and educated and happy and growing, but growth shouldn't come before those other things. So to get back to your next question, that's the reason we started this paper, is we were starting to see more investors talk about this, and to realize that this is a problem because it's a headwind on the economy, and it's destabilizing ultimately for a society, which revolutions tend not to be good for the markets and investment. So it's best to avoid those things. But one group that does some work on this, and we talked to Bill Burkhardt of TIP a little while ago, was the Investment Integration Project back in 2022 published the report System Stewardship: Investing to Address Income Inequality. So what that paper was kind of a primer for investors to help them consider inequality in their investment process. And the report offers a 6-step process. I recommend you read the report, of course, but I will just kind of summarize it here. The report offers a 6-step process for investors to tackle systemic issues, such as income inequality. But this is, I think, one of the first papers they wrote on these topics. So this is a good place to start. That's one, investors must set a systems level goal that affects their investment across all asset classes. And what TIP is about is, and we've talked about this with them, and when we talked to John Lakomnik, is systems level thinking. See how all these things fit together, like the example of smoking and cigarettes and healthcare and economy. If you invest in a cigarette company, there's also healthcare implications to that, societal implications to that, and so on. Two, in this list from TIP, investors must decide where to focus and commit to addressing certain systemic issues. Of course, they have limited bandwidth, limited resources. So an issue like inequality, where do they focus their work? Where do they focus on what they want to invest in or what they want to talk to companies about? Then three, after deciding where to focus, they should allocate their assets accordingly, of course. And then four, investors can extend conventional investment tools to exercise system-level influence. So talking to companies or talking to policymakers or talking to other investors to try to influence that issue. It could have been, 30 years ago, it could have been something like smoking. Now it's something like climate, for example. And then five, investors can further leverage advanced techniques designed specifically to manage systemic risks and rewards. And that gets into engagement with companies or investing, tilting your investments to companies that are sustainable, for lack of a better word, or in this case, addressing income inequality. And then sixth, investors should evaluate the results towards their goals and adjust accordingly. So it's a systematic approach to issues such as income inequality. We gave an example in the paper of the issue of housing. And it's not just the US, but that's where we focused. This is an issue in many places around the world. And the issues are the same. But we looked at two developments in the past 10, 15 years or so that have exacerbated the housing crisis in the United States. One of them was companies like Airbnb. Airbnb is just the biggest, but there's others out there. And what Airbnb does, of course, for those who don't know, is, you can rent your house out to people and get income from it. So say you have a second home, a second vacation home somewhere, you can rent it out through Airbnb and earn some income. Well, that has led to people buying properties just to rent them out. A lot of the people who rent houses out in Airbnb have multiple houses. So they'll have 2, 3, or 4 homes, and they rent them out for income.
Exactly. So those are the ones that were well off to start with. And so they had all this money parked, which is now invested in real estate, right?
Right. And they're making income from the real estate, but that's also limiting the supply. Yeah. And an even bigger problem is that a lot of investment firms have now done something similar, where you'll see investment firms owning hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. And this isn't just in the US, this happens other places as well. And that, really dampens the ability of people to buy a house.
Absolutely. And as we see the income inequality, like the income has not grown at the same rate as the real estate prices. And so basically today, like the millennials, the new generations are not able to buy houses as our parents used to be able to, right? So that is just exacerbating again the whole system and inequality in itself.
And I just went to the chapter in our paper and pulled it up. I just hadn't looked at it in a while, so the numbers weren't on the top of my head. But as of 2024, there were 2.25 million homes in the US listed on Airbnb. And these are mostly people's second or third homes. 2.25 million is a big chunk of the estimated 4 to 7 million houses there's a housing shortage of in the US. So about, they've listed there's about a shortage of 4 to 7 million homes in the US to meet the demand. And about half of those are tied up in Airbnb homes.
Yeah, that's it's huge. And so interestingly enough, I was just looking at Airbnb because Montreal has obviously the same housing problem, and the mayoress announced recently that they're going to forbid Airbnb in the fall, winter, and spring. So it's only going to be made available for people during the summertime when, somebody's maybe traveling for summer and they can rent their house. And so if this is something that increasingly being adopted by cities around the world, what is the impact on the company, on Airbnb, right? And this is where tying to my question, how do asset managers and investment analysts incorporate this information into their analysis? This is the kind of information that not typically looked at, right? And this could be a very insightful data point that could then inform, your models to price that company and to estimate what are the long-term forecasts for the companies. If cities move towards banning Airbnb as a service, what is going to happen to their sales? So they're going to really have to reinvent their business model.
Yeah, and that gets back to any portfolio or measure or analysis. That's where we talk about the systems level thinking that we think they need to employ. To understand what is in this. We're talking about Airbnb here. So in Airbnb's case, it's like, well, what is the market? What is the policy? What is the current policy? How might that change? We see a lot of anger over this, the lack of housing in a number of developed markets. And I pulled up the numbers for investment companies while we were talking. And I'll just read from what we have in the report. According to the data reported by the Pew Trust, gathered by CoreLogic in 2022, and you can look up this paper, investment companies take up about a quarter of the single-family home market in the United States. About 22% of all American homes as of 2022 were owned by investment companies.
Yeah, and I bet it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, and so, as you said, I've heard New York is starting to, something like you can have 2 homes, but not 3. You can have a vacation home, a rental home, but not 10 or not 15, because that just exacerbates the income inequality problem. And again, that's an economic problem and a stability problem for a society. And so you have to weigh whether what is the trade-off of having nearly a quarter of the homes in the country being owned by investment companies that severely restricts the supply. Just take away, just make that 22 number 12.
Yeah.
Then you'd have the problem much less than it is.
Yeah. So thinking about other ways maybe to integrating a broader income inequality into investment decision, what comes back to me was the almost 10 years ago now, the CFA curriculum where we talked about the multi-factor models, right? When you actually calculate, you do the evaluation of a stock based on multiple coefficients, which could be, selected by your choice. And, typically in terms of the geopolitical stability and kind of a stability of the market, often enough, you look at, what is the credit rating of that country as emitter, et cetera. But this question of income inequality, which, as you alluded to earlier, could be one of those tipping points moving us towards social instability and potentially war. This is not currently reflected in those credit ratings. And again, could be an additional insight for the analysts that take this alternative data into their multi-factor models or other assessment tools and have just maybe a better, more holistic evaluation of what are they investing and where are they investing.
Yeah, and part of the issue is that instability of society is hard to fit in a spreadsheet. It's hard to get it down to one number. What does that mean? You can have the Gini coefficient, maybe you put in your model or something like that, and if it gets above a certain level, that could be a problem in Brazil or South Africa or the United States or wherever it is. But I think the word you used that I think more analysts and portfolio managers need to do a better job on is having a holistic understanding of these issues. And then it's not a binary yes or no, or above this level, this is a problem, below that level, it isn't. You go to the extremes to see, when this is a problem, and the one person owning everything, of course, that system will break down immediately because those, in a society of 1,000 people, that 999 people are going to get together and change things. It's just at what point is that tipping point? And you don't want to find that out because, it's very unstable, and history shows us again and again that you have these times of extreme wealth, and then you have the Great Depression or the French Revolution or many other things like those that wipes out everyone, or nearly everyone. And by wipes out, I mean financially wipes out everyone. But also there's often a lot of violence and social instability in those eras. So it behooves us all to better understand how issues like income inequality, this is just the first one we wrote on, really does affect and can affect our investments and our societies, and to find ways to avoid that.
Usually income inequality, climate change, all those big systemic issues are typically left to the governments to deal with. And obviously, from our philosophical standpoint, governments are not able necessarily or equipped enough to tackle this, given the huge role that corporations and capital allocation plays in the market, as well as the voice that those investors, asset owners have in terms of influencing or informing how they want companies to be managed. So tell me a little bit about specific tools or tactics or strategies that investors or businesses can use to address income inequality.
Yeah, well, again, we talked about before, and I'll repeat, is systems level thinking, and that's not just for inequality, but that's for any big thorny issue. Is these things are part of our societies, and to ignore them and saying, well, that doesn't impact my investments, is really short-sighted. So you need to better integrate how systems work into your investment processes.
Yeah. And I think I'll just refer to our earlier episode, right, with John Lukomnik. If you want to learn more about systems level thinking beyond modern portfolio, go listen to that episode. We had two of them, right? One with John and one with Bill, who published them late 2024. So I highly encourage to go and re-listen to those. Okay. Sorry, Matt. So go ahead. So systems level thinking. What's the other ones?
One way I think is for investors and companies to better understand their tipping points that we don't want to get to. And there's this book called Wealth Supremacy by Marjorie Kelly. In it, she has a phrase that stuck with me, that we as investors and companies should focus on profit making over profit maximization, because profit maximization gets you to a place where institutional investors own a quarter of the housing in your country, because they can maximize profit that way. And that's by squeezing people who don't have recourse, limiting the market for housing, and that will make the prices go up. But that's destabilizing for your society. That's a profit maximization way of looking at things. And I think there's a balance that governments and investors and companies need to find on profit making. But at some point, profit maximization makes inequality too unstable. And again, we don't want to find out where that is, and we will if we continually look at measure our success as a society by GDP and profit maximization instead of metrics of well-being, because well-being metrics, part of that is economic growth, and part of that is financial security, but part of that is also health and education and time you have to spend with your family and leisure. And if you don't have any of those things, you can maximize profit, but that's short-lived.
Yeah, I would say that's a hard one though, Matt, because as you know, most of the CEOs and wealthy individuals are a bit running double ledger, right? There's your personal values and family values, and then there's your business. And your business, your only one goal is to maximize that profit and get to that next increase in earnings per share for the next quarter. And obviously, we mentioned the Milton Friedman quote in the paper as well. And what he said is that the only purpose of a corporation is to make profit. And the second part of it was as far as it stays within the rules of the game, which is basically the regulation. The problem is that the game has really changed since 7 years ago when he wrote that. And the regulation has not really picked up. And so we have this huge gap between the business and the society evolving so quickly, and the regulation is just trying to understand what is happening. Same thing with AI now, right? And that kind of leaves a lot of room for arbitrage and for taking advantage of those lacks in regulation, which, is, used for maximizing profit. At the end of the day, the only responsibility of a corporation. So it is a hard one to implement in today's world where everybody's, just focused on one goal, which is profit maximization at all costs.
I'm pretty confident that if you put all those factors into an artificial intelligence and said, if you had the system we have now and profit maximization is what matters above all, what will you get? And the AI will tell you the system will break down. And it's not that the AI is genius. It's just the AI learns through history, just as we should. And this has happened many times before, and it will likely happen many times again. And so, we're very intelligent creatures, but we're often too short-sighted. And that's, that profit maximization at some point breaks the society and breaks the system. And I don't want to learn where that place is, but that's the road we're on. And I'm not any genius by saying that. It's just we've seen this movie before. We've read this story before. Comparing this to the Gilded Age 100 years ago, where we are now, I've seen that many, many places. It's not just me who's saying that, because it's very obvious to a lot of people. And if we continue down this road, investors, we're going to have a 1929 style crash again. It could be caused by these factors. And it is in the interest of investors, it's in the interest of companies to have guardrails that prevent that. And right now, this moment in our history, we tend not to have those. And if we don't implement them, I think the history will rhyme with what we've seen before.
It's a really, really interesting time to be in when we have on one side, climate change, on the other side, the AI, potentially taking over many, many jobs. And then the social net for people disappearing and that inequality just getting worse. And so what is the future of our capital markets, of our economies, when we're just headed in this really wrong direction? Yeah. So there's another one, right? So we do have some indicators that investors could look at. Some of them are, I think, the CEO pay to the lowest paid employee. Can you tell me a little bit about those? And what's the use of them? Like, is it in terms of filtering out the companies that are really bad or engaging? How could investors use those?
Well, I'll go back a little bit. We end the paper with some solutions to inequality. And again, but these are mostly, policy that investors and companies would have to support because they see that it's advantageous in the long term. One is, set a floor which you won't let people fall below. And this gets to the issue an issue of universal basic income, which is, if you think back to the pandemic, in some countries, a universal basic income was given to people so that, the economy didn't collapse. But there was this great study about 50 years ago in the small little town of Dauphin, Manitoba in Canada. And over 4 years, what they did is families could receive a basic income of about $12,000 a year or 16,000 Canadian dollars a year. And measures of physical and mental health improved. Full-time employment increased. More students completed high school because they didn't have to drop out of school. It gave them security. The payments weren't enough for someone to do nothing, but it took away the fear of not having enough to eat or for shelter, which is ultimately, in the metrics that they measured, health, staying in school, physical and mental health, those people were able to get the jobs they wanted instead of having to take any job that came along. And that was better for the economy in the long run as well. So that's one little policy that would be a little bit higher taxes, but for the society, it's better off. Another one we talk about is addressing onerous debts that harm society. And this can be, mortgage loans, student loans. In the U.S., a big issue is medical debt, because in the U.S., we don't have universal healthcare. And so a lot of people run up huge medical expenses because of the debt that's attached to that. Another one we talk about is a fair taxation system. We already talked about that study that showed in the past 40, 50 years, the top income bracket is the top income tax paid in the U.S., not the U.S., but all Western countries has been cut about in half. And that leaves less safety nets for people. Another one, we've talked about system level investing as well, and that's another system level thinking, and that's another way to look at it. And then Maria mentioned we have an annex to at the end of the report. We list dozens of different metrics that you can look at, and I invite you to take a look at that. The pay ratio or education levels or health levels in the country. There's a lot of those, and again, there's dozens of ones we look at, are ways to kind of quantify how our country's doing in this and what needs to be improved. And, a lot of those make up something like the Gini coefficient, where you can see what's the level of inequality in the country.
Yeah, so there are things we could do. Obviously, big role in policy in today's world where we're potentially heading into recession, and all the talks about cutting the tax and deregulation. It's very hard to see this being implemented, but at least we put the word out there, right? We created this connection, hopefully now, between economy, society, and income inequality and the impact on the markets and investment. So the word is out there. I think I just want to call out for some of our listeners, there maybe have been looking at these topics, reach out to us on LinkedIn. Do share what you have discovered, or is there anything else you'd like to share? It's really a peer community that we're trying to create. So certainly don't hesitate to share your knowledge.
Yeah, and the reason we wrote this report is because we've heard more about it, and more investors are talking about it. But as I said, we've seen this story before. We know how this ends. And if we just let it happen, let these things get so bad that it leads to violence or destruction of so much wealth, we want to try to mitigate that and avoid that as much as we can. And so the sooner we talk about these things and the sooner we try to address them, we hopefully get to things before the Gini coefficient in the country gets so bad that there's unrest or a crash of the markets, people are wiped out financially, and society, parts of society collapse and those kind of things. Of course, you want to avoid that. This is just one small piece of that conversation we hope people are having.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. This was really insightful. I look forward to our next report. Curious, what is that going to be around? Do you have any tips? Do you have any ideas already? Or
well, we'll have to talk about that internally, and people can tune in a couple months.
Okay. Oh, throw us the ideas, by the way. If you're listening, if you like our work.
Yeah. If you have ideas of things we should be working on, reach out to us. We're all on LinkedIn, probably the place we are the most. So drop us a line. We're happy to talk. And until then, take care, everybody.